David, thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure.
I'm glad that it worked out that you shall be kind of like the full stop where our journey ends, through our journey through the American mind and psyche. We've come from Nashville, Politicon, and I will not start with that, although I'm itching to talk to you about America. But I want to start with something that surprised me upon learning about you and reading your biography, and I knew things from friends that we have in common, but I didn't know you actually made one of my favorite films of the last 20 years, a short by the name Redwood Grows in Brooklyn.
No way.
Yeah.
Really?
It was very weird. I didn't know you had done
funny.
that. And that changed quite a bit for me in my relationship with movies, because it touched me on a level that other films hadn't. It's a story about a photographer
Sure.
who has a relationship to a tree, I would say,
Yeah.
in Brooklyn. And I was wondering, when I look at your films, and the audience can check them out, there is quite a few.
There are a few.
There's quite a few. What made you do something like that?
That's so funny. I of all the films I made, I felt that one was the least successful. Weirdly enough, like I don't feel the audience ever really got it. It was a hard one to make in a bunch of ways. I also like it's my, I'm not even sure my kids have seen it. Like and I'm proud of it. And I think the message, and it's important, this notion of how we look at cultural amnesia, and that's certainly happening in America. How we look at art and how we look at nature, and the main character in there, James Balog, who's a brilliant photographer, I think had a lot to say. But the film sort of struggled to find its way in a way that is nice to hear. Somebody said it meant something to them.
Maybe
thank
it was too early. It sounds strange.
I'd have to watch it again and sort of understand that.
Yeah,
Maybe I haven't watched it in years, but I'm proud of it, and thank you for watching it. And I think it is, what I was trying to do with that film and all the films I make is have people think different. Everything I do is about how do audiences who watch these films, something flips a switch in them, that they feel, think, act differently in some sort of way. And I'm trying to find truths, even if they're partial truths, in these films through these people, and they're original thinkers. That's what I always come back to again and again. It's not just my business. I really believe in it, and I really believe that that's what we have to have. And so everything I do, I think it just keeps coming back to that in its own way.
That's why I mention it, because I saw it at the time, especially in this relationship with New York, which when I first encountered New York in '92 and lived there for a while, was like, I don't even want to go there. And then a friend invited me back and said, you can't see New York like that, because it's important for the world in the way it's a melting pot and these ideas. And then came A Redwood Grows in Brooklyn, and Time for a New God, Hard as Nails. We'll talk about The Diplomat maybe a little later, Take the Hill. And maybe I'm wrong, but there is a non-esoteric look at spirituality in all of that. Is that something one could say? Or?
Oh, certainly. I mean, and there's also another film I made about faith called Freaks Like Me. But absolutely, and I like that way. I say non-esoteric. I'm not a very esoteric person. I don't have those skills. I look at myself as someone, a generalist who knows a little about a lot, and I don't, and that keeps me, I think, out of esoterica. And I think the filmic part of it is these people have to be interesting. They have to be movie stars. They have to be characters. They have to have the intellectual depth, but also the performative nature of being able to own a movie screen. And that's not everybody can do that. And Justin Fatica and Hard as Nails could. And what I was drawn to him was as a character, and his energy and his explosiveness and all these other things. But the faith part of it runs deep in the film, but it's questioning more than stating. Time for a New God, Redwood, Freaks Like Me have a little bit of a different, we're looking at someone who's spent a lot of time in the esoterica, and can I reel it out and make it understandable for someone who's not a religious person, who's didn't grow up around any religion, and who is a disbeliever on if I'm a non-believer, but I have my own belief system, but none of it's done through real faith, and I think that's what I want to capture in films, that that these lessons are important, and that we have to be able to think and live in a world that has some of these principles in them, but I don't like structure, and I don't like scripture, and I don't like a lot of that other stuff that I think comes with all of it. So I end up finding the films and let those be my own, form my worldview, form my faith in a way.
You said those principles.
Yeah.
What are those principles?
I think anything that tells me how to think, or what to do, anything that's super organized, that has, that's centered in Rome, or centered in Israel, or centered wherever, I'm just skeptical of. I think that it doesn't mean that there's not value in some of those lessons, and I think that's what the films have tried to extricate, is can you take thousands-year-old faith systems and find the modern day applications to some of them, but not get caught up in the levels and the deacons and the priests and the temples, and I find that not fulfilling to me personally, and I understand why for a lot of people it is, and I respect that. My father-in-law is a Lutheran minister, retired. He's a wonderful man, but his lessons are humanist. They're not of faith, even though he's a man of deep faith. And so that's what I take away, and that's what I try to do with the films.
I think it works.
Oh,
I think it works.
It's tricky, but I think it does too.
Yeah.
And I think even Take the Hill, my last film, there's real wisdom in there, and that's what these ultimately are. Is I don't think there's a film I've made that I don't feel is a wisdom piece in some way.
What and who has inspired you to look for those aspects of human life in the manner you do it? Because there is, if again a big word, there's a humanism that goes well through it all.
Yeah, I think I know when I want to make something. Like I can feel it, and I meet somebody, I'm drawn to them. Vice versa, there's that connection, and I want to say, okay, here's something to make. Like the Redwood Grows in Brooklyn came about because I lived in Brooklyn. There was that redwood was in our backyard, basically, not quite, but I looked at it all the time, and as I understood its story, and then as I understood what James Balog was about, melding those two, and I called him up, and he didn't know me very well, and I was like, hey, I'd like to do this with you. Are you interested? And we kind of sketched it out, and we went and we made it, and became, and talk all the time. He's a real valuable friend, and such a wise man in his own right. And so for me, that's what it is saying, okay, there's something inside me that I know has shifted, that I want to make this film. And wanting to make it and making it are two different things. I wanted to make The Diplomat for basically 2 years, and I was making it, but before I found the real funding to make it. And I look at now, the film that I'm trying to make now is a film about fear, called Fear Itself, which is, I haven't, shot a thing. I've written a basic synopsis, but I really think it's an important subject to understand. What's different about this for me than the other films, that the other films have always been built around people, whether it was Jim Balog, my father, or Erwin Kula, or Justin Fatika. This is about a subject, an issue, a topic, and I have to figure out how to make it so that it has the character-driven resonance that I need to have in a film. Like, I don't want to make a movie where I interview this person, that person, this person, and all this stuff, and put it together in a crazy quilt of smart people. But I want to have scenes, and I want to have characters, and I want to have a process in the film that the audience feels very much immersed in the film as opposed to being like, okay, we're going to do this. So we'll see. You know, I want to make that movie, and I think I can. I think I know how to do it, and I think I can find the funding. However, I haven't yet, and I'm not yet, and I need to, and I need to look and say, okay, here's how I'm going to do this.
Are there any filmmakers, literature writers, artists that have inspired you or that you still draw on? Who are your masters?
Oh, such an interesting question. Richard Linklater is really, I was lucky to work with him on my first film that I produced and he directed, called Live from Shiva's Dance Floor. And Rick is just such an outstanding person. He's so deeply engaged intellectually. He understands art. He cares, and his depth of knowledge of film. I mean, he really is a master, and I'm lucky to know him. I'm lucky, when I go to Austin, I get to spend some time with him. He and it's also, there's nothing pretentious about him. There's nothing, grand, or he's just like a guy making movies, but in his brain and his inner sense of what film is so deep and so rich. Yet he's just like a guy who's like, and you don't feel that master sensibility. And so I've really just learned so much from him. In documentaries, what I find is that the people who are making them, who are I'm blown away by, become my friends generally. And so I look at Lucy Walker, who's made so many terrific films, and she's wild and kind of out there in these wonderful ways, and she's making stuff that I'm just so taken with. Roger Ross Williams, who made Life Animated and so many other films, I look at Roger and I'm like, okay, they're people. I worked with Alex Gibney. These are all friends, so I don't look at it and say, oh, okay, these are the people that I go and kneel at their, and supplicate myself. But that's also what I think inspires me a ton is how can I make films that my friends will honor with their respect, and I think that pushes me a lot, and I don't want to be in a situation where I don't feel fully confident bringing them a film. It doesn't mean I wouldn't want to go to them in a work in progress and say, help me make it better, but I want those people to be like, well done. Just like it's just a mutual respect society. And so that for me drives me a lot, that I know if I'm coming out there with something, that the people that I respect that work.
Oh, that's a nice bridge. Mutual respect. Now, part of your life, we leave the dotcom episode out. I don't know why, but you were briefly in the dotcom world.
Briefly, yeah.
Briefly. But you worked for a world that has informed my life tremendously, being European and having an eye on the Anglican world. Sure. You worked on the Today Show. You worked for CBS. You worked for CNN. And you also wrote for Gentleman's Quarterly GQ and HuffPost. Yeah,
a little bit. Yeah, they were small things, but they were real.
Right, but you did that, and the Today Show definitely. I mean, iconic.
Yeah.
Even today. But my question is this. You did that before you started full on with Giraffe Partners, your production company. Oh, I have to ask you the name.
Giraffe, my favorite animal.
All right.
Okay. And the partner that found the company was tall, so we were.
Okay, so that's it. I like the name.
I do too.
You don't forget it. It's like, Giraffe Partners. So you worked in a world that excited me tremendously, and that, in my humble opinion, has changed tremendously since the time that you worked there, and definitely even before. I would like to get your take on the media world as you experienced it. What has happened, and where are we now? Like, in the way, any which way.
Yeah. Look, I was in television before the internet. And that was a big difference. I was in television before cell phones. That was a big difference. And so, for the most part, and I loved working in television because I got to tell stories. And I look at a lot of what I did then, and it was, not original thinkers per se, but there were certainly original thinkers that I was finding and putting on the Today Show. I was finding and putting on CNN. And it was a giant structure and giant companies and all of that. But I was able to go tell stories. I was able to not have to fundraise for each one. I wasn't have to, you didn't have to reinvent it each time.
Sorry, they gave you the freedom. Say, David,
yeah.
hey, find something that's cool.
Find stuff that's cool. And I always tell people, young people are like, I want to be a filmmaker. I said, my recommendation is go make television. Because television is relentless. It keeps on coming at you. It doesn't want you to take time off. There's always an audience out there. And so I tell young people, like, I'll give you the discipline to get shit done and to be accountable to your deadlines. Because filmmakers, like, I want to make a film, and they look at their navel for a while, and then they think about it, and they drink about it, then they talk about it, and and it just takes them forever. And I understand that as a filmmaker myself, that's part of the process, but you end up finding people who don't have the discipline or the efficiency, and part of that's fundraising, but it's also part of them, they want surf breaks, and I respect, but I worked really hard in television for a number of years, trying to put stuff on every day, and I like that, and I'm glad to be free of it now. I think in terms of the overall world, it's shallow, and I never watch it. We don't have cable at our house. We don't. I don't. It's not a part of my life. I was actually at a friend's house recently and woke up, and they had the television on. They had Good Morning America, which is the rival to today. It was just on. Like, that's what they did, and it was so weird to me to hear the noise and to hear the chatter, and I find all of it quite off-putting now because I think it's largely empty. That being said, they are important forces in this country, and I really think that, that I wish that they were telling more serious stories. I wish, we've got major crises all around, but nobody wants to wake up to that with your morning, and nobody wants to have that nonstop. I think on the CNN side, it's just become all politics, and the gamesmanship of politics is fascinating, and it sucks me in, and I spend all too much time reading about everything that's going on in this country, from impeachment to whatever. But I think that creates distractions. To me, television's ultimately a distraction, and so are films in some cases, from what's really going on, and I think that's really troubling. And I look at it not just with the news, but which at least has some merit, but Netflix and all these other things. The idea that Game of Thrones commands so much of Americans' time and energy, and it's such a dark, unhinged worldview. That to me is really troubling, when the dark and unhinged worldview is right outside our door. That to me ends up being a place where I look at those a little bit with disdain and saying, okay, how can you be doing a cooking segment on the Today Show, or be creating yet another nihilistic, dark show that's going to consume people's 25 hours of their life, when they can be doing real things. I feel that way a little bit about sports. I look at and I was a big sports fan. I'm less of one now. But the idea is, these are distractions, and when you look at what's going on in the world, when you really look at it, it's some crazy shit, and you look and say, okay, how are we going to fix that? We're going to take original thinking, we're going to take work, it's going to take focus, it's going to take commitment, and it's not going to take people watching endless hours of fictional television or nonfiction that that is fictional in its own way.
Well, as you went there, let's stay there. I was
Sure.
hoping you'd go there. You went there. We stay there.
Happy to go.
In 2015, you made a film about a gentleman who played a huge role in the life of people like me, like in the late 40s, 50s, now early 50s now, in Europe, who happens to be your father. And usually I don't like to talk about the parents and family of people that I talk to, but in this case, we cannot avoid it, and you made The Diplomat in 2015. Your father is Richard Holbrooke. Let me maybe twist it like that. Your father was a kind of politician, at least, I'm saying this now as a consumer of news, that in the time in Bosnia, for example, and I know Sarajevo very well, and I know how people speak about him on all sides, who was a certain kind of person, a certain type of person as a diplomat, as a politician. And as we just looked at media and how it has changed, can you tell me what has changed in politics and in the way it's done since the time that your father was really active and to now?
Sure. Well, I look at him as a diplomat more than a politician, and I think there's a distinction. It doesn't mean that the two of them are not related. They fully are, and he understood that really well. But I think, from his singular achievement of what happened in Bosnia was extraordinary, that he was able to end that war imperfectly and problematically, but he did it, and he did it with American support. He did it with, all the sort of skills that he could, but, that Americans kind of cared about this was really interesting. And by the way, not only kind of, difficult place, difficult names to pronounce, 3 different warring countries, nobody, and somebody said to me, who was a friend of my father's, who was in the entertainment business, after he watched my film, that he finally understood what had happened there because the film explained it well enough.
That's why I want to bring it up, because it felt to me that what you did was not, of course you made a film about your father, but you also found a way of explaining that conflict pretty well. Yeah. And when we look at that now, which is, the Syria is also very complex. So out of this political world that we find ourselves in, from your point of view, what is really brewing? What's really the trouble? What's really going on the meta-narrative here?
My sense of it, and this was happening in Bosnia in the 90s, it's happening in Hungary now, it's happening in Brazil now, it's happening in America now, is sort of ethnic nationalism in this way that is really unnerving. And if you look at what's going on in Hong Kong, you look at all these different places, we've got major issues, and it kind of amazes me as we sit here that Bosnia is not on fire. It amazes
the people there as well, and we've got some friends here.
Yeah, I've said this, that if you look in the news and there's something about that region, about Bosnia or Serbia, Kosovo, pay attention to it, because even if it seems minor, it's going to become major. If it's made, the New York Times, that means that something significant's happening there in a way we don't understand, and it's the beginning of something very unsettling.
As it has been historically, unfortunately.
As it has been historically, and if you look at it now, you say, okay, here was a problem that was unsettling Europe. It was a problem for Germany. It was a problem for France. It was, and not to mention the Balkans. And at that time, in the mid-90s, Russia was flat on its back. It was post-Cold War. The wall had fallen. Yeltsin was stumbling around, and it wasn't the Russia today of a weaponized internet, of a aggression every which way you look, and masterfully done. But that's what blows me away, is that if you really want, to me, what Vladimir Putin wants most is an unsettled Europe and an unsettled America. And America is, of course, he's roiled so well with this president of ours, but he also wants to break apart NATO. And just this week, Macron said NATO is brain dead. I think was his words. Wow. And that's a dream for Putin.
And Merkel retorted, but let us stay there, because that's a very at the essence, I think, that my colleagues and I are talking a lot about. There are people in Western Europe, which is now the majority of Europe, at least superficially, who say that's a good thing. That's a good thing. It's a good thing that we're moving back into a world of 2 powers. All of that is fine. NATO, the US is still in Germany, blah, 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 blah. How do you feel about that? Because I'm split. I'm not sure. I don't feel easy that you're withdrawing, and at the same time, I can see the arguments of people who say it's time to withdraw. I don't know.
Yeah, this is where I would channel my father, who would be very upset about it. And what the war in Bosnia did was really challenge the transatlantic relationship, which is really important, and I think. These are Western democracies built on a bunch of Western principles, flawed as they may be, but believing in human rights, flawed, believing in freedom of speech, flawed, believing in all of these things that Russia doesn't believe in, that China does not believe in, that Hungary does not now believe in, that Poland has its challenges. I mean, I think we've really, and that to me is incredibly unsettling. And I do think the American NATO presence has been a big part of keeping the peace, with the exception of Bosnia in the 90s. And that to me, when you have Russia that desperately wants an unsettled Europe, and to restitch the Iron Curtain, to restitch that block, I think it's a very dangerous time. And I, if I were European, and I certainly feel this as an American, I would want a strong presence. The problem from American strength, but I also understand that Europe has to emerge and take care of itself. But I don't know. It's stuff I don't know enough about. But I know my father would be bothered by this, and I think in terms of NATO, a NATO pullout, a NATO withdrawal, a NATO brain dead, whatever it is, for the most part over the last 70 years, this has worked to keep the peace in a way that, again, flawed but real. And I think the idea of having any fighting in Europe, any fighting in any of these countries, is really problematic. And it seems to me that NATO's been a force in keeping it peaceful.
When you said, and that's a nice thing to say, you would channel your father, because I guess his generation was very immediately still informed by the Second World War.
Very much so.
And the role the US played. Some say it wasn't liberation. I think it was. But that, I think that's where we're at. Let's go domestic. And by domestic, I mean here to the US of A. And I'm a guest here. I'm a guest who loves it, who's been coming back for a quarter of a century, so really likes it. These principles that you actually say the US role internationally is about. It's about freedom and so on and so forth, business as well, but that's what drives it. How is that looking domestically? Because it seems to be shaky here.
Yeah, look, I think the whole thing is shaky. I just, the whole notion of society, the thing that cuts across political lines, ethnic lines, national lines, party lines, any lines, religious, all of it is that everybody's pessimistic. Everybody thinks that as a civilization, society, future, that we're screwed, and I think that's a very telling thing, and that's why I think the notion of sort of ethnic nationalism, tribalism, whatever we want to call it, is so powerful. Because, okay, if we know this whole thing is shaky, and I think that's a great word to use, if it's shaky, then, when it shakes down, I want to make sure that the people who are most like me, whether they're my family or my fellow, whatever they are, that we have that closeness, and that you trust the people who look like you, vote like you, act like you, live like you, whatever it is. And I think that's really dangerous, because America's strength, to me, has always been built on its multiculturalism, on the notion of immigration, everything that the Emma Lazarus poem on the Statue of Liberty speaks of, which is beautiful when you read the whole
thing.
Oh, it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful and so important to the way. And by the way, I would say the same thing about Europe, that it's the key thing.
And a gift from France. I mean, This is, that's
of course, it says it all. And I think the idea of European, multiculturalism is complicated, but that's what it's going to be. And I think the people who want to keep it white, who want to keep it Europe, who want to keep it traditional, it's a losing battle, but I understand why they're fighting it. But to me, that's a lost cause. And in America, we've got a huge problem with that, because, make America great again could be make America white again. That's what, and if you look in the demographics, and it's not happening that way. And there are 4 congresswomen, freshman congresswomen here, led by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They're called the Squad, and they're Muslim, and they're Hispanic, and they're all black, and all of that is troubling to a lot of people. And to me, that's awesome. And we're going to see a whole influx, I hope, in 2020 of women and men, people of color, people of different ethnicities, people with different names that are hard to pronounce, and that's great, and that's that's to me a future in America that works. However, for a lot of people, that's a future of America that's terrifying, and that'll be the. I think that's what makes it shakiest, is the idea of the big fundamental principle of what we're built on, which is inclusion and immigration and worldwide talent coming to build this crazy thing called America. That's really exciting. If you said, wait, it's just going to be these white guys, it never will work.
I'll let that stand here, and I want to kind of round this off with, you said everybody's a pessimist. I know what you mean. At the end of the day, I don't want to believe it. And you and a bunch of people around here that I know are doing things to counter the negativity.
For sure.
I would count Original Thinkers among that. It's a festival. It happened now the second.
We've done it twice.
Twice. You started this 2 years ago. After for 10 years you were director of Mountainfilm.
Right.
You could made into a global brand, I would say. So chapeau for that. We don't go into the details of that.
Yeah.
But you started Original Thinkers. What was your idea behind it? What is it? Where do you want to go with it? Just
yeah, Original Thinkers as basic is an ideas festival that happens here in Telluride, Colorado, first weekend in October. And we've done 2 so far. We'll do our 3rd one in 2020. But what really is trying to build a community and even a movement of people who believe in original thinking and how important it is.
How do you define that?
Look, it's very much in the eye of the beholder, and I look at it from me as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about ideas and how they flow into our consciousness. I want to find things that I think are fresh and also are, again, humanists, that are accessible. I don't deal in a lot of esoterica. Again, it's how can we take everyday lessons from everyday lives and look at those in an original way. And I think the people that we try and find for our festival can be, amazingly accomplished authors and intellectuals, but they can also be everyday people who've lived lives that are, have major perseverance, incredible challenges, astonishing journeys, and we can learn from that. And
how do you find them? Sorry to.
I find them again through instinct, sort of like I find my film subjects of reading about something and saying, okay, here's a story that moves me, and I say, okay, how do we find those people? And you track them down. There was a story in the New York Times magazines asking, how can one's soul survive atrocity? And looked at Yazidis and Kurds and people who were being treated for psychological trauma in ways that were groundbreaking. And the doctor, I think his name is Jan Kizelan, but he's German and German Kurd, who's a psychiatrist who's working particularly on trauma, particularly with children, and the repeated nature of those traumas. It's one thing to say, oh, my house burned down, but it's going to burn down once, hopefully, knock on wood, but the idea of that your perpetrators are getting away with the trauma, that it was targeted, that it was incredibly devastating, and they're still out there and they're going to continue to do this, and so he's working with people like that. And I was so touched by the story and by his work and how he was looking at not only the trauma, but the nature of trauma victims from the Middle East, from places like Syria, places like Iraq, where it was so intense, and the lack of mental health professionals and the suspicion or the questioning of mental health in general was a whole new thing to work with. And I was like, okay, so I'm going to reach out to him sometime soon and say, and I'll find him. I'll have to track him down, and that's exciting. And say, hey, I have this weird festival in October in Telluride, will you come speak at it? And that notion of looking at how one's soul survives trauma and atrocity, that's fascinating. And there's a whole wealth of original thinking in that. That being said, I also want to make sure that it's not all heavy, and that, one of the shows we did this year that was so successful was called What Does Music Really Do to Us? And there was looking at music through a British Pakistani guy who had fallen for Bruce Springsteen, who had changed his life, and he was great.
It's a film.
It's a film called Blinded by the Light,
Yeah.
and I'd seen that film at Sundance. So that's how I find it, as I go seeing that film at Sundance, find out it's a real guy, saying, cool, I want him at our festival, and work to bring him, and tweet at him and figure out different ways. Then we're talking, and he comes. We had another guy, Rami Assam, who was an Egyptian singer, whose songs fueled the Egyptian revolution, Tahrir Square, but then his songs were critical of the next regime, and he was imprisoned and tortured, and he spoke about that process here, and it was beautiful and powerful, and he played music, and then we had a woman talking about Alzheimer's and how music can unlock certain things in our memory and be a little bit of an antidote to Alzheimer's. So that whole show with performances and sing-alongs was beautiful, and that's what we try and do, and it's having a radar that's just looking constantly, and I'm often reading stuff at night and then ripping it out or sending a link to myself and saying, okay, I want to understand this better. And then I have smart people and smart friends in my life. You'll say to me at some point, hey, David, you should check this out. I think this man is an original thinker. I think this woman who's doing this. And so we have people, and that's what I'm really trying to build, Sasha, as a community of people who say, not only the guests and the films and the programming original thinking, but we are.
Now then, let me tag that on if you have a moment. So there is the festival, and there is things happening during the festival. Are you documenting it? Is it available over the duration of beyond the duration of the festival as well?
We're trying to do a slightly different model, which is have people be in the room. We're asked a lot, did you record what these talks were? It's really hard to record them and make them look good. TED puts a lot of money into those TED Talks. Yeah. And what I'm trying to build, besides as one of the avenues of original thinkers, is what it really started out to be, which was a film company. And so Redwood Grows in Brooklyn is an original thinkers film. Time for a New God is an original thinkers film. All of that was original thinkers films, and I want to have that as a model. And if I can make it work, find the right partners who are saying, okay, original thinkers in conjunction with somebody or another presents a film by somebody or another about somebody or another, and create a brand of films that are original thinkers. I want people to be able to say, okay, I've got lunch, I could watch a TED Talk, or I could watch an original thinkers film, and they're going to be 15 to 20 minutes, and they're going to give people those ideas. They're going to take Rami Assam, the Egyptian singer, and say, okay, here are his ideas, and here is why what he has to say is important.
And cut like a sword through the noise of
That's right. And I think the other thing we're really looking at with original thinkers, which is important to us, is the intersection between ideas and story. It's not just the idea of a PhD who has this, not esoteric necessarily, but a very complicated thing. But in our stories, in our lives, they're big stories. In almost every one of our lives. And if we can find the big ideas within those stories, that's the space that I look at a lot for myself, or for what I want original thinkers to be.
So the narrative is what touches you, and
that's right. And where are the big ideas in that narrative? And I think what's fun about this, I mean, there's a lot that's fun about this. What's particularly nice as a filmmaker is to find other people's films who have profiled somebody who's an original thinker, and we see the film, we say, okay, wait, there's a really well-made film with a great character, a movie star, and most festivals look at those and say, okay, here's a bunch of short films, they're together, but they don't take the time to delve into the ideas within the film. And I really believe that there are really big ideas in really short films, and if we can create that conversation, play a 8-minute film and have a 20-minute conversation or more around it, that gives everybody so much more. It gives the audience the richness, it gives the filmmaker the gratification of seeing their film taken seriously, and it gives their subject a platform that they haven't really had before.
And so we return to a redwood that hopefully still grows in Brooklyn.
Still grows. I checked it last time I was there. It's there. Hey, thanks.
Amen. Thanks for
right
your
on,
time.
Sasha. Hey, pleasure.